Welcome everybody to a very special Prabuddha Bharata-Conversations with authors. Let me begin with a chant. Om Jananim Sharadam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagatgurum Padapadme Tvayo Shritva Pranamami Muhur Muhur Namah Shri Yatirajaya Vivekananda Suraye Satchit Sukha Swarupaya Swamine Tapaharine Sthapakaya Cha Dharmasya Sarvadharma Swarupine Avataro Parishtaya Ramakrishnaya Te Namaha. So namaste everybody. Today we have a very special Prabuddha Bharata Conversations with authors. This evening's theme is Sri Ramakrishna's vision of Christ explored from a Christian theological perspective. Let me begin by just briefly sharing why we are experimenting with this format today. Many have observed that the traditional lecture format, especially in spiritual and academic spaces, has become somewhat saturated, and that there is a growing desire for more dialogical, podcast-style conversations where ideas can unfold more organically. Someone's mic is on. Please, everyone mute their mic. This evening's session is our humble experiment in that direction. Secondly, the topic is quite distinctive. Sri Ramakrishna's experience of Christ are usually examined from a Hindu, yogic, or Vedantic perspective. This evening, however, we will be doing something unique. We will explore them through a Christian theological lens, guided by one of the world's leading comparative theologians, someone deeply grounded in both Christian theology and Vedantic thought, Professor Francis X. Clooney. Before formally introducing Professor Clooney and our esteemed members, let me just briefly outline the program today. After the introduction, I will offer a short presentation on Sri Ramakrishna's experience of Christ and his relationship with Christ, especially for those who may not be so familiar with this dimension of his life. Following that, Professor Clooney will give a brief presentation on a PowerPoint slide presentation that he has made regarding the lives and mysticism of Christian saints. And following that, I will pose a series of questions to Professor Clooney, inviting him to reflect how various aspects of Sri Ramakrishna's visions of Christ might be understood from within Christian theology. And in the final segment, approximately the last 30 minutes, our distinguished panel members will each pose their questions, allowing the conversation to widen further. The entire program is planned to be 90 minutes, and we will remain flexible and attentive to the flow as the discussion unfolds. So with that brief overview, let me just first introduce Professor Francis X. Clooney. He also has the title Father. He's also a father. He's a Jesuit monk and priest. And he also is a doctor. He's a doctorate. He is the Parkman Professor of Divinity at Harvard Divinity School and a Jesuit priest, internationally recognized as a leading scholar of comparative theology and Hindu Christian studies. He received his Bachelor of Arts from the University of Notre Dame and both his MA and PhD from the University of Chicago, where he was trained in the history of religions with specialization in Sanskrit, Hindu theology, and comparative religious thought. Professor Clooney has long-term scholarly engagement with Vedanta, Sri Vaishnava theology, and Bhakti traditions, and is especially known for his careful devotional reading of Hindu texts from within a Christian theological commitment. His scholarship is grounded in sustained engagement with primary sources in their original languages. So he's very fluent and proficient in Sanskrit and also Tamil. And he studied the works of the Vedas, Upanishads. He teaches classes on them at Harvard, as well as he's studied the Alvars in the Tamil tradition. His work has helped define comparative theology as a discipline that moves beyond surface comparison towards deep learning across religious traditions, modeling how fidelity to one's own faith can coexist with genuine openness to another. His most recent book, A Love Affair with Hinduism, reflects on decades of lived engagement with Hindu text, teachers, and devotional worlds. He also has contributed, he's actually very, beyond his scholarship, he has a very special relationship with the Ramakrishna mission. He's contributed many articles, I think about 10 articles to Prabuddha Bharata, many on Sri Ramakrishna. If you would like access, please go to our Prabuddha Bharata archives.com and subscribe to that. He also has been instrumental in establishing and sustaining the Hindu monastic fellowship at Harvard Divinity School, a year-long program that brings Hindu monastics to Harvard Divinity for full participation in academic coursework and community life. And I think, Professor Clooney, I think 4 batches have now gone, right? First was Swami.
Yeah, at least 4, yeah. And there'll be another batch next year.
Another batch next year. So Sarvapriyananda Ji, Swami Harinamananda, I was the 3rd batch, and one Brahmacharini Durga from Santa Barbara. And I'm very grateful for Professor Clooney. I learned so much from him. But I think beyond his scholarship, one of the things that influenced me most about him was his relationality. He has such close friendship with monks of our order, nuns of our order, within our order and outside of our order. If you type in Professor Clooney and Hindus, you'll see Swami Narayan, Chinmayananda Mission. He has so many links and good relationships. So I think I would like to call it a lived pluralism. And that influenced me. I think I've also made many friendships at Harvard, and I've kept those friendships up as well because of that. Thank you, Professor Clooney. It's a great honor for having you. Next, I just really quickly like to introduce our esteemed panel. On the left is Swami Viprananda. He's a monk of the Ramakrishna order, and he is the minister in charge of the Johannesburg Center in South Africa. Thank you, Swami, for being with us. Namaste. Next is Brahmachari Isha Chaitanya, a Master's of Science and PhD. He's a monk of the Ramakrishna order and an honorary faculty in life sciences at Ramakrishna Mission Residential College, Narendrapur, Kolkata. Thank you for being with us. Next is Dr. Amy Fu. She's an associate professor at Hangzhou City University, and she's also a Harvard Divinity School International Fellow. I met her there, we became friends, and Dr. Amy Fu has done something very substantial for our order. She has translated many of Swami Vivekananda's works into which language? Is it Mandarin? Dr. Amy? Which language is it that you've...
Yes, Mandarin.
Okay. Yes. So that's she's done significant work there. Next is Dr. Arpita Mitra. She is an assistant professor of history at Banaras Hindu University. She's also a scholar in Ramakrishna literature, has contributed many articles to Prabuddha Bharata, and most recently, she's edited and recently published a new book, Liberate Your Mind, Life Lessons from Sri Ramakrishna. And you can, if you'd like to purchase that, you can go online to purchase that. And next is Anuradha Bhattacharya. She's a graduate of Presidency College, now Presidency University, where Swamiji Vivekananda himself attended. She is a master's in sociology, and she's a school teacher, and she tries to inspire the young students with Swamiji's educational ideals. and she's a well-read devotee and student of Vedanta for many decades. And last but not least, Amandeep Singh, a doctoral student in the Department of History at Banaras Hindu University. And he has a very interesting dissertation, the history of, the history of the Vedanta, the movement of the Vedanta societies
movement.
in Northern America. So thank you all for coming. And with that, let's now, the next part of the program, we're going to do a brief presentation about Sri Ramakrishna and Christianity. And we're going to actually, through Google Earth, we're going to take Professor Clooney and other people watching from Harvard. We're going to come and take you to Dakshineshwar. So the video.
Okay.
I'll start the PowerPoint presentation. Put a slide. Okay. Go to the PowerPoint. Okay, I can make that larger. Okay, so this is a brief timeline of Sri Ramakrishna and Christianity. In 1868, he had a meeting with Michael Madhusudana in Dakshineshwar. Also, he visited a church, which is right near us at Advaita Ashram, at 56 Rendranath Banerjee Road, Osman Memorial Church. It was established in 1868. He visited there with Mathur Babu. In 1871, a devotee, Shambhu Malik Charan, he introduced him to Christianity, and he used to read the Bible to Ramakrishna for 3 years approximately. In 1874, Ramakrishna had this Christ vision for 3 days, describing that. In 1882, Ramakrishna expressed a desire to enter into a church to see how they pray. So he visited from the outside the Holy Trinity Church on Amherst Street. In 1885, it's in the Kotamrita or Gospel, M tells Ramakrishna the similarities between him and Christ. And in 1886, Swamiji describes Ramakrishna's suffering of cancer like Jesus' suffering on the cross, vicarious atonement for the sake of their devotees in the entire world. Next slide. Swami Viprananda, you can please read Ramakrishna's. Now we're going to go to Jadu Malik's garden house, which is just located right next to Dakshineshwar. And I would request Swami Viprananda to read Ramakrishna's own experience of Christ in 1874.
The master used to say that he sat one day in that parlor and was looking intently at that picture and thinking of the extraordinary life of Jesus, when he felt that the picture came to life, and a thousand rays of light coming out from the bodies of the mother and the child entered into his heart and changed radically all the ideas of his mind. On finding that all the inborn Hindu impressions disappeared into a secluded corner of his mind, and that different ones arose in it, he tried in various ways to control himself and prayed earnestly to the Divine Mother Kali. "What strange changes art thou bringing about in me, Mother?" But nothing availed. Rising with a great force, the waves of those impressions completely submerged the Hindu ideas in his mind. His love and devotion to the Devas, gods, and Devis, goddesses, vanished, and in their stead, A great faith in and reverence for Jesus and his religion occupied his mind, and began to show him Christian padres, priests, offering incense and light before the image of Jesus in the church, and to reveal to him the eagerness of their hearts as is seen in their earnest prayers. The master came back to Dakshineshwar temple and remained constantly absorbed in the meditation of those inner happenings. He forgot altogether to go to the temple of the Divine Mother Kali and pay obeisance to her. The waves of those ideas.
Swami, excuse me, Swami. I think for the purpose of time, I'll just thank you very much for the reading. We'll just summarize the rest. So Ramakrishna had a vision of Christ, and Christ entered into his body at the Panchavati. It took place here. And just a couple of other things. Ramakrishna kept a photo. On the right-hand side is this photo that he kept in his room of a drowning Peter and Jesus saving him. Okay. With that, we'll just conclude the PowerPoint and start. And let's go to Professor Clooney now. Okay. Wait, Professor. Professor Clooney, so that concludes our, just for everyone's edification, Ramakrishna's experience. So just for the purpose of time, we'll get to your slides in a little bit, but I'd like to start with the first question, if that's okay with you.
Yes, fine.
Okay, so the first question regarding Mother Mary and baby Jesus and Yashodā and baby Krishna, is there any special meaning or significance in the relationship between Mother Mary and baby Jesus? And how does that compare with the relationship between Mother Yashodā and baby Krishna? In the baby Krishna-Yashodā relationship, this is understood as a particular spiritual attitude, vātsalya-bhāva, which practitioners themselves can cultivate as a path of devotion, of thinking of God as your child. Is there any type of equivalent of that in the Christian tradition?
Thank you, Swami. First of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here with you today. And to turn, for the sake of time, directly to that question then, I think in some ways, both Yashodā and Krishna and Mary and Jesus do represent, first of all, the humanity of mother and child. There are complications in both stories, of course, about how Jesus came, how Krishna came. But nonetheless, the images we see of Mary and Jesus and Yashodā and Krishna show that tender love that mothers have for their children. And I think that in some ways, certainly on the Christian side and in this Christmas season, Christmas only a few days away, is an invitation for Christians, perhaps particularly for mothers, I can't say, to think of Jesus not simply as their Lord or Master or teacher, but as the child whom they can love and express tender devotion for. So as you say, Vatsalya. I think, therefore, it is parallel to the stories of Krishna with his mother Yashodā in the village. I think we know less about Mary and Jesus as mother and child as Jesus grew up. There are not many stories actually in the New Testament about what happened after the baby was born. And we see more in Bhagavatam, book 10, canto, all the cantos about Yashodā and Krishna. But nonetheless, I think we can see the parallel and that the invitation to be like the mother and the child relationship can be helpful to many people.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Clooney. Let's go to the... well, let me just follow up on that. So do you know, do people at all, do they have that? Is that idea, or is that idea there at all? Because I know Christ is usually looked upon as the Lord of the, Lord of the world, and that idea of personalizing that relationship, is that there at all in Christianity?
I think we see evidence, let's say, in some of the mystical traditions in monasteries in the Middle Ages, both men and women imagining different ways of relating to Christ. One can be as Lord and Master, one is as Savior, one is as teacher. But also we can see these more intimate relationships, and that the idea of Jesus as child and the devotee as a mother, I think does show up in Christian mystical literature, just as you have the Nayaka Bhava, this idea of being intimate to one another as a man and a woman would be in love with one another. So too, there are medieval nuns who would imagine themselves being married to Christ. And so there are parallels, I think, that one can see. For most people today, I suspect it's a mixed, set of relationships. Yes, Jesus in the crib. Yes, Jesus the baby. Yes, Jesus on the cross. Yes, Jesus is a social liberator, a changer of society. So it's hard to pin down and say this is number one devotion, but it's certainly in the range of what's very approved and acceptable to believers.
Thank you. Okay, the next question we have is in Sri Ramakrishna's vision at Jadu Malik's garden house, as Swami Vipuranji just read, rays of divine light emerged from the mother and child and entered into him. From a Christian theological and mystical standpoint, how is such descending light understood?
I think that's a question, a good question also. And that part of the Great Master is a beautiful part, one of the first parts I paid attention to 40 plus years ago, I suppose, when I first read the Great Master. And I think there are, in one of the issues in the Bible and in Christian tradition is a strong belief that God is ineffable, God is a mystery, God is beyond human imagination. However, that God communicates with us. And therefore, there are different ways in which natural symbolism is used to imagine the relationship. So, like God as fire, God as a voice, God as a symbol of power, let's say an arm reaching out. But also these more subtle images, such as light. And this is perhaps one of the more beautiful ones, because just as we welcome the light at dawn and the light of daytime, or have a lamp lit in the darkness of the night, the idea that God is the one who brings light into the world. And the Gospels talk about St. John's Gospel, Jesus is the light in the darkness, and the darkness does not overcome it. Jesus says to his disciples, you be a light in the world. Don't keep your light under a bushel basket, but take the basket off and be light. Because light is gentle. Light also tells us what we look like. It enables us to see ourselves in the broad daylight, which can sometimes be frightening or threatening to people. But the idea that the luminosity of the divine form would come out is, I think, a beautiful symbol, that because light is both material and spiritual in a certain way. So it's a very appropriate symbol.
Okay, so it's light, is it kind of like, does it have like a revelatory aspect, would you say, like unfolding divinity that in Christianity then?
Well, I think it's a way of imagining relationship with God. Some mystics talk about being touched by God. Some hear a voice. Some see an image of Jesus, let's say. Yeah. The light image is more subtle because it's not anthropomorphic. But no, I don't think any Christian would say, well, God is light, or light in the sense of physics or matter is the same thing as God, but rather this is kind of a spiritual reality that we all experience. What is light? What is the wind that blows? These are symbols that are very subtle. And to say God is like the wind that blows, the spirit. God is like the light that shines. So without literalism, it's one of the better, more, like you might say, sophisticated symbols, getting away from the anthropomorphic, like God looks like you or looks like me and so on like that.
Okay. And like, I think that in the examples, you can correct me if I'm wrong, in Christian saints, like we say, St. Paul, he had a vision of light on the road of Damascus. And I think that was an internal light, not something from external, if I'm not mistaken. And same thing, I think, with St. Augustine, these were internal lights. And I think St. Teresa of Avila, that was also more like an internal light, if I'm not, but I think St. Francis of Assisi, I think at Mount Tabor, he had, was that light of external, was that an external light that came out onto him?
I mean, and if and when we get to the slides I made, some of these images will appear there. But I think it was not Mount Tabor, that was the transfiguration where Jesus' light comes out to the disciples. But I think the idea that the light is within and the light is without. So certainly when St. Paul is on the road to Damascus, it's a light outside himself. It's not a light within himself. By this light, he is blinded by this light. He's transfigured by this light. And he's blinded for 3 days because the light is so bright he can't see. And that's another element of the light, that if you stare into the sun, you cannot really be able to see in that light, and it can be damaging. So the light from outside, the same as St. Teresa of Avila being transfixed by somehow an experience of God. Other passages in her mystical writings, she might talk about the inner light, or John of the Cross might talk about the light in the darkness. So I think there are different ways of imagining the light, but often in the Christian tradition, because we have a strong belief that God is, even though God is around us, God is within us, God is also transcendent, God is other, God is beyond our imagination, and the metaphor of God being outside, coming to us, is a very important image as well, even if then the God who comes from outside comes inside us as well.
Professor Clooney, at this point, we can go through the slides, so you can just give us some edification. We can start with the beginning of the slides so that we can learn a little bit about Christian history.
Okay. So if we could go back to the first one then.
Okay.
Yeah. So I picked out a series of pictures. You can find them mostly on the internet. Some are from the Harvard Art Collection. Here is a scene of Moses at the burning bush. Now, part of it's cut off because of the size of the screen, but nonetheless, Moses is out taking care of the flock, and he sees a bush that is both alive and being burnt on fire at the same time. He comes near. The voice says, "Take your shoes off. This is a holy place." And then he begins somehow to talk to God, who is somehow present in the burning bush. So it's a physical symbol. He doesn't see God in this scene, but somehow the impossibility of a bush that's on fire and yet fully alive is a symbol of that. Next slide. These are our famous images of the Virgin Mary with the angel Gabriel, who's there with the wings in the middle, coming to Mary. Angels are considered to be messengers from God. That's what the Greek word angelos means. Angels come from heaven. They speak here. The angel in Luke's gospel is explaining to Mary, "You shall be the mother of the Messiah. You yourself have not had any intimate sex relationship with a man, but you shall be the mother of the child." And you can see from the upper left of the screen down to Mary, there's a beam of light. So the angel is speaking, but then the light coming from God enters into Mary, and this is a symbolic image of how the child enters into Mary. By the way, over on the far left, you have Adam and Eve being expelled from the Garden of Eden. And this is a reminder that something went wrong in the beginning, and that when Jesus comes into Mary, something begins to go right. Next. Here's simply another of the same thing. Again, you can see maybe less clearly, but from the middle left part of the screen, so the beams of light through the wall over to Mary. And the angel again is there with Mary, but he's bowing down to her because she is greater than the angels, because now she has the living God within her. Next. This is one of the many, many images of Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist in the Jordan River at the beginning of his ministry. And it seems to be what other people were experiencing, a baptism of repentance. So be baptized in the Jordan River, have your sins forgiven, be purified. But then when Jesus is baptized and comes up out of the water, there is on the very top of the screen, which is portraying here God the Father, and calls out, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." And the dove, the white bird there, the dove, is considered to be the Holy Spirit because it flies around, it has the movement in the air. And so it's kind of a manifestation for Jesus of his Father and of the Spirit. And then for the people watching, like the devotees on the lower left side, seeing that Jesus, who's been in the river, is now manifest as God. Next. This is I mentioned the transfiguration. So in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's a scene where Jesus takes the three apostles, Peter, James, and John up on the top of a high mountain, today identified as Mount Tabor. And he is there as an ordinary person, he's praying, and suddenly, this doesn't show it very well, there's a very intense light that comes out from him. And it's taken to be the light of God descended onto him, the light coming out of a cloud of light around him. And the disciples kind of fall to the ground. Here they're looking up, and then later in the scene they'll fall to the ground. But some kind of a mystical moment of being in the light of Christ. The two men with him at the top of the screen are Moses and Elijah. Moses being the giver of the law, the first books of the Bible, and Elijah being the great prophet. So that the word of God in the Hebrew tradition is manifest in Jesus, and the disciples are the ones who see that and receive it. Next. Now these, you actually showed, Swami, you showed scenes of this. There are two scenes of religious experience. There's a scene, I have another slide of this as well. So Jesus, the apostles are out on the boat in the storm, and Jesus comes walking to them across the water. So this is obviously taken, again, physically, to be a sign of some kind of a supernatural engagement, that he walks on the top of the water in some way. And Peter says, if that's you, Jesus, then call me to walk over to you, to leave the boat and walk to you. And Peter, in his faith, begins to walk toward Jesus because he has faith and because Jesus is saying, come to me. And then as the scene goes on, it seems that Peter realizes, what am I doing? I'm walking on the water. I can't walk on the water. So when he turns his gaze away from Jesus to himself, he begins to sink into the water. And Jesus has to reach out and grab him by the hand and save him, saying, Peter, how little faith you have. If you had faith, you could walk on the water like I do. Next. This is the same thing. You can see these images of Peter there at the top, asking Jesus to forgive him, forgive me as a sinner. And on the bottom, the scene I just described, the apostles in the boat and Peter being lifted out of the water by Jesus. So it's taken to be a metaphor that if you have faith in Jesus, you can be like Jesus and you can do as he does. If you look at yourself only, you'll lose that faith and you'll begin to fall down. You'll begin, in samsara, in the world, in lack of faith, you'll begin to sink. And so this is a remedy for that. Next. This is the one, again, Swami, you referred to, of the conversion of St. Paul. And if you go on the web, there are many pictures of this. In this picture, he's with soldiers who are accompanying him. He's going to Damascus to arrest the Christians. He's against the Christian community. He wants to have people locked up and put in jail because it's a sect, and he wants to stop it. And the people he's with on both sides of him suddenly come to a halt because Paul is thrown to the ground and they cannot see or hear what he sees and hears. And what he sees is this blinding light, which blinds him for 3 days. And the voice he hears, I'm not sure if that's actually the Greek of the saying, Paul, Paul, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he begins to realize that when he persecutes the believers in Jesus, he's persecuting Jesus himself. So this is a very classic story of conversion, because up to the moment before this, Paul is out to arrest and put in prison all the new Christians. Suddenly at this moment, he becomes one of the greatest Christian believers of all time, simply because Jesus broke in and changed his life. Next. And this we were looking at already. St. Francis of Assisi, one of the great saints of Christian tradition, had a number of Jesus experiences. Early in his life, voices would speak to him, telling him to change his life, to give up all his wealth, to follow Jesus as closely as possible. But here, toward the end of his life, on Mount Alvernia, not Mount Tabor, but Mount Alvernia, he has an experience of Jesus, which is, again, it's kind of cut off on the upper right hand of the screen, of the crucified Jesus. And the crucified Jesus with the light coming out from the nail holes in his hands, his feet, and his side, the places where he was pierced by the nails and by the spear of the soldier. And these come into Francis himself, because he becomes like Christ. When the light comes from the outside, piercing his hands, his feet, and his side. Next one, please. Here is, again, this one stresses more the symbolism of the light coming from the top of the screen. So some kind of a transformative experience of Francis, who's already a mystical person, but this really makes him into another Christ. That by this experience, he bears the marks of the suffering of Jesus in himself and becomes, to see Francis is in a certain sense to see Jesus himself. Next. Another of the same thing. This one you see very clearly. Somehow the crucified Jesus is flying here, is floating above him, and you can see the beams of light coming down to his hands, his sides, and his feet as he is transfixed. Next. Some of the scenes deliberately don't show you much, and I wanted to stress, here is St. Gertrude of Helfta, who's one of the great medieval Jesus mystics who had great love for Jesus, would talk to him, he would talk to her, he would visit her. And then sometimes it seems like this, that she's simply sitting by the window there. You can see the light coming in from the left, looking up at the crucifix. And it's a very traditional Christian symbol. Many men and women, many nuns and priests, many lay people over the centuries have looked at the crucifix. But somehow when she looks, she gets a sense of this intimate sense that it's alive and that somehow Jesus through the cross is speaking to her. Next. Here again, some of the stories of Gertrude of Helfta. Again, she lived, I think, in the 14th century, where that her heart was transformed and the heart of Jesus, which is coming down from the right side of the screen on the up above, comes down and replaces her heart. So that it's both an external scene, the light and the heart coming from outside, and then after that, when she looks into her own heart, is somehow the heart of Jesus. The symbol there that looks like IHS are the first three letters of the name of Jesus in Greek. But the idea that it's an outside image, the heart coming to her, and then after that, it's the heart within her as well. Next. This is an interesting scene because it's one in which there's no imagery really. Ignatius Loyola, 16th century founder of the Jesuit order to which I belong, he has already a number of mystical experiences. He lives in a cave for a while. He has feelings of God in his heart. But when he is sitting one day by this Cardona River, very quietly, as portrayed here, perhaps reading from a book, it says he suddenly has a sense sitting there without any voice, without any imagery, of understanding everything he needs ever to understand in his life. So kind of like a moment of quiet enlightenment. And he says if he could trade all his mystical experiences, everything he had experienced in his life for this 1 second, that would be enough. And I stress this because sometimes the mystics don't have a sense of a burning bush or Jesus coming to them or fire or a light, but simply like this illumination of their minds. And this is a good example of that. Next. Okay, so I think they're out of order, but I'll just keep going as is. Thomas Merton was a monk, Trappist monk, monastic of the 20th century, very famous because he wrote a book called Seven-Story Mountain, the seven-level mountain, in which he talks about how he went from being a fairly secular person born in 1915, losing his secularity when he was at Columbia University in New York, and beginning to find his way to the presence of God. And by the time the 1930s are over, he finds himself entering into a monastery, the Trappist, to spend the rest of his life there. So it's an interesting story, again, without any real voices or visions or levitations or anything. There he is in the presence of God as a Trappist. Next. And this is a revelation. This is an actual street sign in Louisville, Kentucky. So he was a monk in the monastery near this place, Louisville, the city. He'd come in, I believe, for a dentist appointment. And he's coming in for the dentist appointment. He's waiting for the priest from the monastery to pick him up after his dentist appointment. And as it says, Merton had a sudden insight at this corner on March 18th, 1958, that led him to redefine his monastic identity with greater involvement in social justice issues. To quote, he was suddenly overwhelmed with a realization that I loved all these people. He found them walking around shining like the sun. And what seemed to happen here, he's waiting there on the corner. He's not in the monastery, he's not praying, and looking at the people going by, and he realizes that his mystical experience is now bound with the experience of the people around him. As it says, the people around him are shining like the sun, and he began to see the presence of God in them. Everybody walking by just sees a monk standing there. They don't see any light or hear any voice, but there he is, and they appreciate him. And from this moment on, he became more interested in social justice, the ending of the Vietnam War, and eventually became interested in learning from other religions as well. Next. And this is another quiet scene. Dorothy Day is one of the great religious figures of the 20th century, also born in 1897. And she is now up for canonization. There's a push in Rome to make her Saint Dorothy Day. But she is a very ordinary person. And this scene, when she's a young woman, you can see her there looking very ordinary. She has experience of God through having a baby. And in her book called The Long Loneliness, she has a sense of, what is this gift that God has given me to have a child? And she says that because the child was stirring within me, because the child was coming to birth, maybe some of the vātsalya that Swami mentioned earlier, she realized that God has given me a gift that has to change my life. As you can see, the sign that's, I think, just stuck in there. Why should the resources of human genius and the riches of the people turn more often to preparing arms than to increasing the welfare of all classes of citizens, particularly the poor? And what's striking about her is that, again, like Thomas Merton, going for justice, helping all people, but without any vision, without any voice from heaven, without any light, without becoming a monastic, because she never became a nun or anything like that. The ordinary experience of having a baby brought her to God and changed her life completely. Next. And there she is. Again, I show this scene because it's very ordinary. She's the woman on the left with the big hat on, and the daughter, Tamar, is the little girl sitting in the middle, who died only a few years ago. And they're just there on the beach on a nice day. And this is, you might say, a mystical moment for Dorothy Day, because she was there. She experienced God in having a child, and this was enough to change her. So as with Thomas Merton, there's no particular mystical supernatural event, but the little event like this can change a person's life. I think it tells us that our experiences in life can change us as well. Just as with Sri Ramakrishna, he's in the garden, he's walking in the garden, and suddenly has this Jesus experience. We don't necessarily know that it's coming, but when it comes, suddenly it changes us. Next. Okay, that's the end. So some were left out, but that's okay. We'll just go from there. So that was meant to give you a few examples of mystical experience.
Thank you, Professor Clooney. That's quite a lot of information you gave us there. I had just one question when you said, I think it was regarding St. Francis, that he becomes Christ. I think you used those words. Is there any when you say becomes Christ, is there any sense of separation at that time? Is it that he becomes Christ, or is you understand what I'm saying? Like, how would you?
I mean, he's the saint. People have said this. So he lived around the year 1200, and it was a time when the church, and believers were looking for some sense of what Christ is really like, and people even in his lifetime said to see Francis is to see Jesus. And then over the centuries, people have said, if anybody in human history, in the history of the church, has been Christ-like, it was Francis of Assisi. Even up to figures like Thomas Merton, Dorothy Day saying the same thing. But I think it's a rhetorical point in the sense that, the Christians know a lot about who Jesus was, the Son of God, come down from heaven, Lord of Lords, God of Gods, and yet saying the paradox of the utterly supernatural, divine, transcendent God, the Son of God, Jesus, when we see this little Italian man walking around, we're seeing Jesus. So I don't think it's not an avatar, it's not an incarnation. And Francis would say, I am simply a hopeless sinner. I am not worthy to be considered like Jesus in any way. But when they see him, and then when they see the nail holes in his hands and feet and his side, then they realize this is what Jesus is like. If Jesus appeared in the year 1200, 1300, this would be what he's like. So it's kind of a sense of course he's not Jesus, and yet he is Jesus. Sort of beta, beta, in a way.
Thank you. Going back to Ramakrishna now, with these wonderful examples of saints that you've presented to us, if I talk about the second experience of Christ merging into Ramakrishna after the end of the third day, Thakur Ramakrishna saw a foreign-looking man. He started to walk towards him, and then he merged into him. And I think Ramakrishna said, this is the Jesus, the savior of redemption, who redeemed humanity.
Mm-hmm.
So are there any kind of similar experiences? How would you explain that experience from a Christian theological perspective?
I mean, I think several things, let me say. I mean, first thing would be in terms of those slides that I showed, and I could have showed 25 more.
Sure.
There's a certain sense in which there are many different ways to imagine what it's like when God comes to somebody personally. And again, from the outside, from the inside, light, a voice, a personal encounter, something frightening, something consoling, that there are many, many different ways in which God experience has come about in Christian tradition. And one reason for looking at the lives of saints is that most of them have some kind of a story of something dramatic or something very quiet in which they have this experience. And I think, therefore, although I don't think I know of an experience by a Christian saint, just like the story of Sri Ramakrishna in the garden merging with Jesus. Even Francis of Assisi didn't say that. But as we saw in the picture, the cross kind of floating above him, the crucified Jesus, and the piercing light coming down to him. Or the Annunciation where the light comes from the one side of the painting down into Mary, and she now has the child within her. That the idea that God can speak and contact somebody in different ways, and why not walking in a garden? Why not kind of merging in? That's also possible. Maybe it does remind me of one example after the resurrection of Jesus, of the woman who loved him best, Mary Magdalene, stays by the empty tomb. And she's there after the apostles have gone back to the city. They don't know what's going on. And a man comes up to her and stands next to her and says, Mary, why are you grieving? And she thinks it's just the gardener. He's just an ordinary looking man who's kind of taking care of the cemetery grounds, the garden. And then he calls her by name, Mary, and she realizes that it's Jesus, and she throws herself down on the ground in front of him. And that's sort of that intimacy. They don't merge into one another. In fact, he says, you cannot touch me because I'm going to the Father. But this idea of the intimate, close touch. And likewise, other scenes of the resurrected Christ meeting people, sitting at table with people. But something as intimate and intense as Ramakrishna's experience, I think I don't immediately know of something by a Christian mystic quite saying that. And then let me just add one other point. I think it's not, for me, I don't think it's a problem to say, well, how could Ramakrishna have a Christ experience? He's not a Christian. I think there are many encounters, even in the Gospels 2,000 years ago, where Jesus was not limiting himself and saying, I'll only speak to certain people. So he speaks to a Canaanite woman who's not even Jewish. He speaks to Roman soldiers. He has a confrontation with Pilate. There are different people to whom he speaks, he has encounters with, and in a sense, reminding us that Jesus is not the private property of the Christian church, that you can't say you have to become a member before you see him, but rather Jesus is the light of the world. Jesus is there for everyone. And therefore, if Jesus enters the life and heart of a person who is from a different tradition, I think that's theologically quite possible. There's no problem with that, I don't see.
Okay, we're almost coming near the end. So I have a couple of other, thank you so much, Professor Clooney. You've given a lot of information and insights. Going back a little bit, I had another question, question 3. In Ramakrishna's own words, or I think it's in the Great Master, Swami Chidekananda wrote it, that Christ began to show Ramakrishna Christian padres offering incense and light before the image of Jesus in the church, and to reveal to him the eagerness of their hearts as seen in their earnest prayers. So, you read the gospel in the Kotamrita, Ramakrishna gave great emphasis to this Bengali word vakulata. He used to say, I think in Bangla, vakulata na hoy bhagavan ke pawa jai na. Without spiritual yearning, one cannot realize God. Can you talk about that? Because we see, I think that, if I'm not mistaken, prayer is a big part of this sadhana in Christian and Catholic and Christianity. Can you talk a little bit about that? And is this yearning, is it an end? Is it a means? And how does one cultivate yearning? Is it something that people can cultivate in their lives?
Yeah, I mean, I think, let me say one thing first about the scene you just mentioned. I believe that Ramakrishna visited Christian churches several times, and perhaps he saw a service going on with the priests with the incensing the statue of Jesus, the Murti, and that would be taken in a spiritual way. That it's not simply mere ritualism, external ritualism, doing something with the incense, but it's one way in which believers were showing their devotion by the flowers, by the incense, by the lamps, by the prayer in the church, honoring Jesus, and then special feast days of the year like Christmas, Easter, Good Friday, doing the same thing. So using the incense that you can smell, the light that you can see, the flowers that are beautiful, all of these things are quite realistic, and that Ramakrishna would somehow realize that meeting Jesus is also meeting the devotees. Just as I've always found that reading Great Master or Gospel, you're also meeting the people whose lives were changed by Ramakrishna. It's not just like a solitary, like I want to meet him, everybody else get out of the way. No, it's you meet the community as well. But I think the other point, the more important point that you're pointing to, is that I think in all the figures I showed, from Moses on to Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton, the gift of the moment of where the yearning is awakened, where you suddenly have this God experience that opens you up, that like sets you on fire, can be, it can be a long time in coming, or it can come suddenly, as with Paul on the road to Damascus. But then you have to then say, okay, now what about the rest of my life? What do you do after an experience of God? And I think it's in some ways a metaphor of like a little flame has been lit, kindled, and then you have to like keep feeding it firewood. You have to like cultivate it so that the flame grows up. And if you just say, okay, I lit the flame, and then you go away and come back 3 days later and you're disappointed that it's burnt out, well, that's your fault. I mean, because it doesn't simply light itself. And therefore, I think prayer can be, in the Christian tradition, praying for religious experience, praying for health, praying for a loved one, praying for peace, praying for safety, and so on like that, praying for an experience of God. Because people can look and say, why is it that so-and-so seems to have experiences of God and I don't? Or why is it that Thomas Merton was a mystic and I don't have that experience? People can be praying for this, but people who have had experiences of God, and I know many people in my parish, the church I go to on Sundays, where people have, and they keep it quiet. They don't go around saying, I had a mystical experience, but they have these experiences in their life, and then they still come to church. They still come for Mass. They still say the Rosary. They still do good works, maybe teach religious education, because you have to kind of live out what God has given you. So Francis of Assisi had transformative moments, then had to spend the rest of his short life both aiding others and praying and fasting. Thomas Merton continued being a monk for a decade or more after his experience in Louisville. Dorothy Day lived another 50, 60 years after her having the child and trying to live it out with the poor. You could point to Mother Teresa in Calcutta, who had this mystical experience that made her leave her religious order because God wanted her to help the people on the streets. And then for the next 40 years or so, she had to get up every day, get bodies, dying people off the street, feed them, care for them. You just have to keep going. And so I think prayer can be a way of receiving the gift, cultivating the desire, and making it more intense. Just as by ascetical practice, you can try to prevent other desires from taking number one place. So no, it can't be, do I want to watch Netflix or do I want to pray? Or do I want to have a drink or have a nice meal? Or do I want God? Drinking, eating, watching Netflix can be good things. But if they get in the way and say, well, this is actually more satisfying to me than seeking God, well, then there's something wrong and you have to pull things back to purify the desire again.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Professor Clooney. I'm just going to end with a personal question, but there is the problem of evil. We talk about in Vedanta, the guy, is God impartial or not? So sometimes I think in Vedanta we have the idea of reincarnation. So that explains that God's not being partial towards one towards or another. But when you say about Saint Paul walking on the road of Damascus, and he gets that experience, it's just a question that rose in my mind. Could that not raise a problem? Is God being partial towards one as towards to another? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, two things. I mean, one about God being partial. Certainly, the figures, from Moses on, these figures were singled out. Even Peter, of all the 12 apostles, was singled out as the leader. Why Francis of Assisi and not the man who lived in the next house? Why Gertrude and not the other nun? That there seemed to be God chooses people. Certainly it's all over the Bible. People are called by visions, are called by voices, are called by the people. You are our leader. You are the one chosen to do God's will. Jesus himself, baptized in the river, suddenly the heavens open and the voice of God says, "This is my beloved son." There is a choice. And I think why, in some Christian traditions, let's say with Jesus, well, he's the Son of God come down to earth, that's why. But for others, you could say, well, there's either something about their lives that makes them suitable, like Paul, who was Saul at that point, his name gets changed to Paul. Saul already is an intense person giving himself entirely to his faith. It may be by Christian standards the wrong faith, because he's out to, put in prison all the Christians rather than helping them. But he's a man who's given up ordinary life. He's not a merchant. He's not a rich man. He's not a governor or anything like that. The intensity of seeking God makes him a person that if you could just break that open, then the same intensity would be working for God, as he did as he toured the Mediterranean the rest of his life, preaching the gospel. The idea, it's a bigger topic maybe for another time, but why is it that some people then are chosen to have blessed, glorious, successful, happy lives and other people suffer? Christians don't believe in reincarnation, but we do believe in original sin, and that we're born into an imperfect world where the sins of others create conditions where our own lives can suffer. So if some industrialist is polluting the environment and the mother is sick, that can be transmitted to the baby, and the baby's born with lung problems. Or if the mother is a drug addict, that can be communicated into the baby. Or other things can happen along the way. And then as we grow up, we make choices about what we eat. Do we smoke or not? Do we drink or not? Do people have casual sex with partners who might have diseases? All these things are personal responsibility that then can come back on one's head. But the basic Christian message, and I think this would be similar to the message that might be in the Vedanta tradition. You're in a situation, you're healthy or not, you're rich or poor, whatever. You have freedom and choices where you are about what you do with what you have. So why is it I don't have lung cancer and somebody else does have lung cancer? Okay, Clooney, what are you going to do with the health you have? I'm not a homeless person on the street. What are you going to do with the life you have? We're all put in the position of saying, with God has given you certain things or not given you certain things. Now use it to preach the gospel, to bring help to people in trouble.
Okay, thank you, Professor Clooney. I think we're at the, we have 30 minutes left, and our panel has been waiting so long. So each of you've all submitted questions, but what you've heard today, if you have any other, if he's answered your question or you want to ask something else. So let's start with Swami Vipranandaji. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you, Professor. I think you have answered at least part of the question that I had, but I want to read it just for completeness. And there's a small bit at the end that's additional to what you have said. Regarding Sri Ramakrishna's Christ experience, where he meditated on a picture of the Madonna and baby Jesus and saw Christ walking towards him in the garden, how do you understand the theological status of this experience? Can it be genuine and phenomenologically similar to Christian mystical states, but theologically different, especially since Sri Ramakrishna was not a Christian? What does it mean to have a Christ experience without being a Christian? Is this even possible within Christian theology? And could the reverse happen? Could a Christian have an authentic experience of Mother Kali or Lord Krishna through meditation without converting to Hinduism? And what does this idea mean for religious pluralism?
Okay, thank you very much. Wonderful questions. So I did in part answer it before, that I think, again, as I said, I don't think Christ is the personal property of the Christian church, or that there's like a membership card. You can't experience Christ until you have the permission. And therefore, people outside the Christian faith who have experienced Jesus, there's no reason for me to say, well, that's not possible. One of the beautiful early gospel stories about this was when the three magi, often translated as the wise men, come to see Jesus. They read the stars in the heaven. They come from Persia, maybe. They come and find their way to Bethlehem. They worship him with exceeding joy. They realize he is the one they've been looking for. And then they go back home. And there's no kind of requirement that they convert and become Christians or stay with him, but that momentary experience of great joy, a worship of Jesus they met, changing their lives, but without saying, now you have to become a Christian or you are a Christian already. They're allowed, they go back, and that's simply in the gospel. I think it has to be similar when, like Sri Ramakrishna, the experience in the garden. Again, similar to some of the pictures that I showed, the images that I put up, the sense of intense experience of the loved one, intense experience of Ramakrishna, son of the great divine mother, Jesus, son of the great divine father. This transformative experience where when a Christian has such an experience, it does sometimes put them into meditation states for days at a time where their lives change. As I mentioned, Ignatius Loyola, by the river, suddenly everything he needed to know in life was given to him in that 1 second. Sri Ramakrishna, for 3 days, he kind of is in a state of being a Christian in a certain way. I see no reason to take that away or to say that's not possible. And I think logically speaking, therefore, the reverse is possible. There are all kinds of theological issues you might imagine about the reverse. But I've found myself, in certain temples, let's say at Tirupati, the temple there, or at Dakshin Kali, the temple outside Kathmandu Valley, or in reading certain texts, even certain parts of the Great Master, an experience that comes upon me that I think I would not get from Christian sources or from the Bible. And I think what I don't do is say, therefore, this is the same thing as I experience as a Christian, or this proves that all religions are equal, but rather I, who am a certain kind of Catholic Christian, had an experience in the temple. I had an experience reading this Bhagavad Gita text, Tamil poetry text, that has changed me. And it's clearly from a source outside the Christian tradition. And I simply confess that and say that's what happened, without getting into theological debates with theologians about is it the same thing and so on. So I'm not trying to avoid answering, but that's the kind of way I would approach it, Swami.
Okay, thank you. Next, we'll go to Dr. Arpita Mitra. You can please put her on next.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Namaste, Professor Clooney. It was really a pleasure hearing you. And with the kind permission of Swami Chidekananda ji, I'll just share 2 brief responses to his presentation today. Can I? Before asking my question? Yeah. So my first response is, I think others would also agree with me that when he was presenting the light entering Mother Mary, we were all reminded of the light entering Sri Ramakrishna's mother from Yogi Shiva temple. There's a Yogi Shiva temple in Kamarpukur, and we believe that she said that a light entered from Yogi Shiva. So this is one parallel that others must have also noticed. And another parallel that I could think of was in Peter drowning, when he stopped looking at Christ and started looking at himself. Sri Ramakrishna was also fond of telling this story. I don't remember it accurately. Maybe the Swamis can help me with that. There was a man who wanted to cross a river and walk on a river, and somebody wrote something on a chit of paper and gave it to him and said, you just believe in this and you will be able to cross it. So he went halfway through, and then he suddenly thought, what's written in this chit? And he opened it and he saw only the name Ram. And he thought, what nonsense, how can I cross this with this? The moment he doubted, he drowned. So this is the other parallel about faith. And my second response, I'm feeling too tempted to share this response. It's up to you whether you want to respond to it or not. I was very intrigued to see that most of the time we saw the light or the heart or something coming from outside, coming down from above in almost all the representations. I'm not talking of the light entering Mary, because that's a completely different instance. You know, she was being impregnated with that. But in the other cases, it's Jesus descending on somebody, or the light descending from outside, or the heart descending. Whereas, I don't know, as a practitioner, I don't know, maybe we are more used to thinking of something coming out from inside. I mean, this struck me, you know, something coming down from outside and from above, and something coming out from inside. You may or may not respond to this. So I'll come to my question, which I had already submitted. There is a well-known framework formally introduced by Alan Race to understand Christian theological response to other religions, namely the threefold typology of exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism. How might upholders of each approach respectively view Sri Ramakrishna's Christ experiences? Can Ramakrishna's cross-cultural spiritual experiences contribute to enriching our understanding of interfaith interactions? This was the question which I had submitted, and to this I would like to add, since you have emphasized twice with reference to Christ merging into the body of Sri Ramakrishna, that Christ is not the personal property of the Christ. He belongs to the world. So anybody can have a Christ experience anywhere. Do you think that there is a danger of misinterpreting this liberality as religious inclusivism? You know, Rana's idea about the anonymous Christ or anonymous Christian, or have we understood inclusivism wrongly? I mean, I don't know which way. I mean, maybe we have not understood it. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for wonderful questions. Glad to meet a real Hindu theologian. So you're a very theological person. Thank you. The first thing I would say, thank you for the story about the crossing of the river. I think I may have heard that once before, but now I'll have to look it up and tell people about it. I think the metaphors that Christians usually work with is that God is other than us, and God is supernatural, transcendent, greater than we can be. And so many of the stories begin with this from the outside. And that sense that God is not us, God is not within us. And then taking over like the inside. And so even though Mary is a special case, that's kind of the extreme example of God coming from the outside and then growing within. And then, Francis' bodily experience, the nail holes in his flesh are somehow signs that Christ has visited him. Other saints changing their minds and changing their choice about what to do in life. All of these are examples, I think, of the idea that the Christian belief that, God is transcendent and other, but God is part of our lives. Thomas Merton, Dorothy Day, finding God in the faces of poor people. That God is here, and therefore we have to find God locally. So the tension of the in and the out, but it is perhaps different from most of the Hindu traditions of which we can think. I think that, the question about Alan Race's categories, exclusivism, inclusivism, pluralism, which have had great influence in the last 40 years in Christian circles, although many people today are saying, well, they don't really work. Can't we think in other ways? But the traditional view was exclusivism meant Christ only. There is no other way. So Christ alone is the Savior. Other traditions are not saving, therefore Christ alone. The pluralism tradition, there are many ways to the top of the mountain. There are many ways of experiencing God. We have our way in Jesus. You have your way, you have your way, you have your way, and so on. And that in between, the inclusive position, you mentioned Karl Rahner, a sense that somehow there's a universalism that is not derogating or insulting other people's religious experience, but that it's all in Christ. That somehow everything is in the cosmic Christ, the universe exists in Christ, everything is in Christ. Wherever there is truth or way or life, there is Christ. So it's a kind of mysticism, the believer seeing everything that I say and believe is in Christ, from Christ, for Christ, and so too for the world. And that, therefore, from that perspective, one might say, well, look, when Sri Ramakrishna experienced Christ in the garden, he was learning about the greater reality of which he was a part. And clearly the great master doesn't say that. I think I would say that all of these positions, exclusivism, inclusivism, pluralism, particularly now 40 years later, they all have some truth to them, but none of them are quite enough. I think many Christians who think about these things say, you can't just say God comes only to Christians and other people have no way of salvation except in Christ. The idea that we live in pluralistic societies, we all have to be able to say our sisters and brothers of other religious traditions are also on the path to God, also have spirituality. That's a kind of pluralism. And even you see the popes now doing this. Pope John Paul gathering religious leaders in Assisi in 1986 saying, we're all praying for peace. Some kind of a sense of the pluralism is not going away. The world is not going to be 100% Christian. So let's get used to it and realize this is God's plan for the world. The inclusivism one, there are about 5 different kinds of inclusivism nowadays. So it becomes very tricky. One is sort of to say, whatever you think your experience is, it's really an experience of Christ. It's a little bit like Bhagavad Gita chapter 9. Whichever God you pray to, you're really praying to me, Krishna says. Other kinds of inclusivism are really talking not about the person who's not a Christian, but about the Christian, saying, I can somehow include what I've learned from your tradition in my understanding of being a Christian. And that's maybe not what was meant originally. But I find that, like I mentioned, having an experience of God at Dakshin Kali Temple or Tirupati Temple, that somehow this was given to me to become part of my own Christian experience. Without saying, going to Tirupati, going to Jerusalem, same thing. Or Virgin Mary, Kali, same thing. Without saying that somehow these gifts that come from outside Christian tradition, I can include them within my own. The liberality of maybe saying too much, I think that's right, is that we all live within traditions that have boundaries. And therefore, to be a free thinker and saying, whatever I think, I can just run with my imagination. Maybe it would be an exaggeration. And then it sort of demeans or insults all the traditions to say, oh, whatever you want to do, just do. It's like consumerism that I think we have to avoid. Maybe I'll stop there. But thank you for wonderful questions. Swami, I can say a few extra minutes so we can definitely get through all our speakers. So we don't have to cut it off at 9:30 exactly. But
thank you, Professor Clooney. And before we get to the next question, I just wanted to ask, when you said that these saints had the experience of seeing Christ everywhere, what exactly is Christ then? Is it, how we have this Nirguna Brahman, God without qualities, God with qualities, God without form, God with form. So it sounds kind of pantheistic. What exactly is that Christ that they're seeing everywhere? Is that a quality? Is that a principle? Is that the spirit of consciousness?
It seems to be a sense that you find in the Gospels, first of all, that whenever you meet another person, somehow you're meeting Christ. Christ is your sister, Christ is your brother. The famous Last Judgment scene in Matthew 25, that Jesus says to those who are saved, "Blessed, come into my kingdom. When I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me to drink. And ye be cursed, go into hell for the eternal fires, because I was hungry and you didn't feed me. I was thirsty, you didn't give me drink." And they both say, "When did we see you hungry and thirsty? We never even met you. Whenever you did this for the least of mine." So it's kind of it's not really a pantheism, but it's a sense of the Christ who's Jesus of Nazareth, that particular man, somehow is present in every reality. And everything is kind of infused with the presence of Christ. It's kind of a poetic imagination. But calling it pantheism, I think maybe, because the Christian God is somewhat like in Vaishnavism, Saguna kind of trumps Nirguna and becomes more basic, seeing God with qualities, and the qualities of God in Jesus are kind of infinite because he's human, and therefore everything human has Christ in some way.
And then we'll get, is there a difference between the incarnation Jesus and Christ? They're not, are they synonymous, or is there like Christ thou art in heaven? Is that like the transcendent? Is Christ in heaven the transcendent, and is Jesus, would that be considered like an incarnation?
Well, I mean, you're right now at Christmas. So Jesus is the name of the boy who was the Jewish boy who was born, his something like a bar mitzvah. That was the name given to him, Jesus.
Yeah.
However, even in the Gospels, he is the Christ, the Messiah, the expected one. So Christ is not his last name, like John Smith. It's not Jesus Christ, Mr. Christ, but rather it's a title. But neither of them, they're both earthly names, Jesus and Christ, and that by the Gospels, the eternal Son of God, the Word of God, light from light, God from God, is the transcendent, but that Jesus and Christ are two ways of naming him in this world.
Okay, thank you, Professor Clooney. Let's get now to the, I think we'll get to everyone as Professor Clooney has kindly agreed to go a little bit extra. Amandeep, you submitted a question, and so you can go next, please. Unmute yourself.
Thank you, Maharaj. Thank you, Professor Clooney. It was a wonderful talk. And I have something different to ask you. I just want to know your personal experience, as you have for more than 40 years of experience being a practicing theologian, and you are into the Vedanta societies, and you, so I would like to ask you that how Vedanta has influenced the lives of American followers, those belonging to other faiths, without proselytizing them. This is how roughly I have just framed my question. So I would like to know your personal views.
Okay. So one thing I could say, I look forward to reading your dissertation, because probably you'll answer these questions about the role of the Vedanta
Yes.
Society in North America. Be curious what you find. It seems to me that if we're talking about the Vedanta Society and the Ramakrishna mutts and so on like that, the influence I think is it's not universal. Some people know very much about where the Vedanta societies are in Boston or New York or San Diego or Hollywood, whatever. They're quite aware, and other people drive by and they have no idea. But I find the Vedanta societies are often more low key than the Hare Krishnas, and people think of the Hare Krishnas dancing on the street corner. So that's kind of like in your face, much more external, or at least it used to be. And then, as people point out, and I'm sure you found, 100 years ago, more of the Vedanta members in the United States were white Americans. And now the majority, I think more than half in most of the missions, I could be wrong, are of South Asian origin. At least the places I've been to, that seems to be the case, that there are more, not invariably, like I was, anyway, something like that. But I think the message of pluralism, the message of we're all sisters and brothers, back to Swami Vivekananda, and that I think has gotten into the American consciousness, that somehow all the religions are speaking of the reality of God, that we need to live as sisters and brothers. So the whole spirit of the Parliament of Religions, and then the Ramakrishna order is one of the main follow-ups to that in the United States, showing the universality and the way that we're not in competition. We have to be in our own traditions, but also open up. But I think, and we could talk about this another time, my sense is that most of the Swamis are not like media superstars. Most are fairly low key. I could name different Swamis who are very well respected by those who come for the Sunday service, but other people will not know them. Somebody like Sarva Priyananda might be an exception, because everybody, when he was at Harvard, so many people who are not Hindu or Vedantan seem to know of him and seen his podcasts and so on. But that's somewhat exceptional rather than the ordinary way. So I think maybe it's like the yeast in the loaf, that when you eat the bread, you don't say, okay, the yeast is over here and the bread is, the flour is over there. It's like an invisible presence that probably has done more good than we realize in this implicit fashion.
Okay, thank you, Professor.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next let's go to Dr. Amy Fu.
Okay. Hi.
Hello, Amy. Good to see you.
Professor Clooney, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I particularly like those beautiful artwork, your PowerPoint slides. I somehow your narrative about religious symbols work like the light. The narratives are such for, and I'm thinking that it would be interesting to do a comparative artwork sort of comparison, and reminding me some pictures I've seen in museums, yeah, and now they got new meaning after what you have explained about details, like Saint Francis of Assisi. I mean, I've been to his church, his hometown, and now it has a different kind of meaning. Thank you. And also, I was interested in your talk, encountering God in so many different ways, particularly the modern mystic monk Thomas Merton and Dorothy Day. Wow, that is somehow really new to me, the way you interpret their Christ experience using the same words, like their 12th century mystics. Okay, so thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I have two questions, but I think you have partly answered the question. The first question is, what, if any, is the tension between being a scholar and a priest in the 21st century for you? I mean, for me, they're just different. Being a scholar, you have to be objective, and being a priest in this new age was, say, everybody's talking about AI technology, etc. So, what is there any tension? My second question is, after doing for more than 40 years, what do you think are the contribution of comparative theological work to Christian theology, the first part, and also the second part, do you think, aside from learning from Hindu tradition, could the Hindu traditions benefited from your comparative theological project? Yeah, that's the two questions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, great questions. I can send you, if you'd like. So I mentioned like Dorothy Day's The Mystical Experience of Having a Baby. She wrote about that both in The Long Loneliness, the autobiography, and in several other pamphlets. I can send you a PDF of those if you'd like to read more, because it was like, you know, taking the metaphor of the Virgin Mary having the baby Jesus and saying this young woman in 1927 or something like that on Staten Island, New York, has a child by a man she's not married to. And suddenly this opens up the spiritual for her. And for other women, having a baby doesn't, you know, turn them into saints. But for her, somehow this gave her a whole new sense that life was greater than her. I can send you something if you remind me about that. To the scholar and priest, so Swami referred to my book at the beginning of the talk, at the session, but not with the right title. So my book, the memoir that came out last year, Hindu and Catholic Priest and Scholar, A Love Story. So that's the book. And part of what I wanted to communicate there is the tension between Hindu and Catholic, but you're asking about the priest and scholar part. I mean, I think, you know, like other Jesuits, so most Jesuits, many Jesuits at universities, on university campuses, Boston College, Fordham, Georgetown, the Holy Cross Fathers at Notre Dame and all that, also do masses and they preach in the church. And I think there'd be many different ways that the priest may talk about what do you do in the classroom and what do you do in the church. I think in some ways it is different, because in the classroom, it's not simply a matter of more readings and footnotes and intellectual discourse, but it's trying to understand this without worrying about where it leads spiritually. Do you understand what we're talking about? Can you read this text and see what it means? What are the questions you have? And you can't do that, let's say, in a church on Sunday, tell people, you know, we have questions here. My homily today will just be all the questions and no answers. That doesn't really work. So on Christmas, people will be expecting what is the meaning of Christ in 2025? And I think it's not simply a matter, you know, when you're a scholar, you have freedom of speech, freedom of thought. And in the church, you have to conform to the doctrine. Within limits, you do have to conform to the doctrine, but you also want people to use their brains. And what did we just hear in the reading? And what does this mean for us today? Because I have the confidence that the readings given for any given Sunday will actually help people if you try to get them to read the reading in a new way without simply saying, oh, I know what that says. It just says the same thing as every other reading. No, it raises questions and forces people to open their minds. So I think in the classroom, the main thing is the opening of the mind, which may have spiritual benefit. The spiritual benefit in the church may come by way of opening the mind. And that's sort of what I do. I mean, the different priests in the parish I go to, some of them are more pastoral, spiritual. It's not that I'm footnoting my homilies, but I'm always pushing people by giving them something to think about that they haven't heard before. So I think there's a big crossover between the priest and the scholar. And I would resist if somebody said, well, as a priest, you have to say the following, whether you believe it or not. I think I wouldn't agree to do that, because I'd have my intellectual mind. And then the final part about, I think definitely the comparative learning, Christians learning from Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim traditions and others. I wish I knew more Hindus who studied Christianity seriously. So I think not only knowing something about Jesus or whatever has come down through Hindu thinkers, but actually reading a gospel, like the gospel according to Matthew, from the first chapter to the last chapter and studying it, or reading, not just saying, oh, Teresa of Avila, a great mystic saint, actually reading one of her books. I don't know too many Hindus who actually do that. And I think it'd just be a good thing to do more of that. One of the Swamis, Swami, you may remember, has a book out on Carmelite mysticism. It's a very beautiful book. I forget his name now, it's on the shelf. But he actually took John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, and tried to study them in relationship to the Vedanta spirituality. But we need more of that. And I'd say more people in China to study, not just think about politically about Christianity, but actually read Christian mystics and so on.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Clooney. Our last question is Brahmachari Isha Chaitanya. Please unmute yourself.
The last but one. Did we have two more to go?
Okay.
Anuradha?
Yeah, we'll ask her afterwards. After she didn't submit a question, I'll ask her after.
Okay. All right.
Thank you, Professor Clooney, for the wonderful presentation. So my question is about the role of the reasoning and faith in Christian philosophy. We find in our Indian philosophies, like in Upanishads and Bhagavad Gita, there is a dialogue between teacher and the student, where the teacher takes stepwise and then explains him logically about the path forward. Especially in Christian books that I came across, like whether it's in Sermon on the Mount or the Imitation of Christ, I didn't find that kind of dialogue between teacher and student. Is there anything in Christian philosophy that is something similar to this, which could actually help in our spiritual practices?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. You're right. I mean, it seems to be very clear, even in texts like the Upanishads or Bhagavad Gita, but then Shankara, Ramanuja, and others, the role of the teacher is so important in the back and forth, Purva-Paksha, Siddhanta, and so on like that, this kind of thinking through, raising questions. And some of the Christian books come across as if it's simply, the discourse is given and there's no kind of back and forth element. But I think in much of the Christian tradition, the books come from classroom experience or teaching experience. That the way in which in the monasteries or in the schools, the back and forth then gets written down afterwards. If one looks at probably the greatest or most influential of the Catholic theologians, Thomas Aquinas, a number of his books have this kind of Purva-Paksha Siddhanta style, the Summa Theologiae, where any topic like does God have a body? Is Christ's death helpful to all people? There'll be like 4 or 5 skeptical points about criticizing the Christian position, and then he'll give the Christian position, and then he'll rebut one by one the negative views that have been raised first. And that seems to reflect like the medieval 13th century teaching style, the back and forth. But I think it's a good question because many of the books of Christian theology I can think of today leave out the teaching part. And they may, in the classroom, say, let's talk about this. But when the book comes out, it's sort of like a discourse by the master without the Q&A, the back and forth element, and without the stories about the guru and disciple and so on like that. So I think maybe Christians should do a better job of showing how the teaching actually works. But if you're interested, I could give you a sample from Thomas Aquinas of what I'm thinking of. If you'd like, we could be on email about that as well.
Yeah, that would be nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Anuradha, do you want to unmute yourself? Do you have any? You have to unmute yourself. Okay, now you can speak.
No. Oh, you lost it again.
You have to unmute yourself. Okay.
I have
It keeps going back and forth.
Keeps going back and forth.
So it's muted again.
Yeah, you're going back and forth.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Don't
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
now we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hello.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Please accept my pranam, Father, to me.
Thank you.
Okay. And Maharajji also. Please accept my pranam. I had a simple question. Do you need to prepare yourself before you enter into reading books and having any vision or experience in other religions? Or how do you keep your value, your Christian values, or how you keep yourself value neutral while you are studying other religions, so that you can get the right essence of the other religion? Like
Yeah,
you have the process of indigenization of Christianity in India. Okay, so how you avoid that process of indigenization of Christianity in India? How we avoid influencing our own religion value? So, coming in the way when we are practicing other or studying other things.
Yeah.
You prepare yourself, because we see Thakur preparing himself before he is doing sadhana in Islam or Christianity.
Okay. As I understand the question, I think the preparation that we need to go through is not that different in one's own tradition and learning another tradition, and therefore, like the model that's given often in Vedanta, Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana, that works. There are versions of that work well in Christian context. You have to Shravana, you have to know the text, you have to study the text, hear the text, read it carefully. Then the Manana, you have to raise the questions, think about it, go back and research it, all kinds of intellectual activity. But then you have to bring it into some kind of meditative process. And I think if I'm getting ready I'm giving my sermon in my parish this weekend, I have to study the text, then I have to think about it, and then I have to figure out what does this mean spiritually. But if I'm then preparing class and I'm doing something with Bhagavad Gita, let's say, or poetry from South India, it's a similar process of knowing what it's being talked about, not superimposing my Christian views on it because it often doesn't say what a Christian would say, but being clear about what it says and then thinking, what does it mean? And looking at commentaries, looking at historical research and so on, and then saying, but does this spiritually speak to me? And because I do believe it's possible to be spoken to by a sacred text from outside one's own tradition. So I think the preparation is back and forth, a similar process, but that it means also that if you cease to be spiritual in your own tradition and start being merely an academic with ideas and no spirituality, that's probably going to spoil how you learn from another tradition as well. You'll just have ideas, and it'll all be kind of secondary. And I think that can happen sometimes. Somebody becomes so objective and so scientific that they've lost both their own spirituality and they can't learn from the spirituality of others. So the back and forth, I think, element is important. The indigenization is maybe I didn't understand the question, but I think religions adapt to the cultures in which they're found. So Christianity is not native to North America. Catholicism is not native, nor is Christianity native to India. But anytime one goes into an Indian Catholic church or a New York Catholic church, you can see they're different. The music, the style, the way the priest preaches, the way people dress. And I think I know Hindus living in the United States, in Boston, or studying at Harvard, who are not the same as Hindus I meet in Chennai or Madurai or whatever like that. So I think part of it is natural. You are part of the culture. See that being a person of faith is still part of the culture. You don't have to be, I'm a Catholic, not an American, or I'm a Christian, I'm not really Indian. No, I'm an Indian and I'm a Christian, I'm an American and I'm a Catholic, but not turning that into like a rhetoric about everybody in India should be a Hindu, or everybody in North America should be a Catholic. Those are things that can be dangerous and oppressive of people. So I think maybe.
Father, I wanted to know, like in Thakur's life, you see when he experienced Christ, or when he experienced in Islam faith, his total Hindu faith and Hindu ideas of God was wiped out. Is it like that?
Well, I think it might be like his experience where, as it says in the Great Master, for 3 days, he pushed all his Hindu ideas to the side, the corner of his mind, and kind of lived as if he was Christian. Really, the question is, well, what about the 4th day or the 7th day or the 23rd day of the next year? How do these things influence? But in certain sense, to suspend. So when I read the Quran, I have to be able to, in a sense, put aside my understandings of who God is, who the prophet is, what the Quran says about Jesus, just to understand the text, and then to learn from it spiritually. But then 2 days later or a week later saying, okay, what does this mean to me? I'm a Christian, I have not converted. What does it mean to me as a Christian is a further question that arises. And I think, as Swami and others have done, you can sort of see the role of Christianity in the life of Sri Ramakrishna later on in his life as well, and so on like that. So we better stop with that, I think. Over to you, Swami. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Clooney. Thank you, the panelist members, for your excellent questions. And we really appreciate your coming, and I hope you can come again later on. So,
Okay.
let me just close with a chant. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
If I may, Merry Christmas. Blessings for the new year also.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Okay.
Merry Christmas.
Okay. Bye. Thank you.
So this is what my 6-year-old daughter was making while.
Oh, very nice. Oh, very Christmas.
Merry Christmas to everyone. Yeah.
Give her my compliments. It's very nice.
Thank you.
Okay. See you all.
Mm-hmm.